Hello, welcome to Embroidery Tool Tips. Our topic today is troubleshooting machine embroidery issues with Kay Hickman.
We all love embroidery, especially when everything goes well. When we find that perfect design for that perfect project and the design stitches out perfectly with no problems along the way. But every once in a while we have one of those days. One of those days that can be very frustrating when things go wrong. Maybe the outlines don't match, the threads break, the needles break, or thread nest. Sometimes these things happen, but today we're going to explore some of the causes for these issues. We'll look at a good stitch out first. We want the threads of the design on the top to lie flat and smooth and the fabric around them to be pucker free. The only thing we really want to see on the top side is the needle thread. But for the design to be perfect, the bottom should not look as good. An embroidery design is actually unbalanced stitch. If doing regular stitching, our goal is for the needle and the bobbin threads to lock between the two fabrics, but the goal here is that the bobbin thread be tight enough that it pulls that needle thread all the way to the back, which translates to mean that you should be able to see some of the color on the back side of the design as well as the bobbin thread. One of the most important things when it comes to stitching out a design is to be very careful with your threading. With the machines that stitch at such incredibly high speeds that they do today, it's imperative that you thread correctly. Even missing one thread guide can cause the tensions to be off. It might even be a good idea to double check your manual every once in a while just to make sure that you haven't forgotten that one little thread guide that it should be going through. You should always thread with the foot up and the take-up lever in its highest position. When the foot is raised, the tension dials of the machine move apart. You then place the thread through the threading guides, and then when you lower the foot, those tension dials close on top of that thread. That is what keeps the thread tension consistent. But if you have the foot down, and then you try to thread the machine, the thread cannot go down between those dials and it just kind of lays up on top. And at this point you're going to get some very inconsistent stitching and some really bad problems that I'll show you a little bit later. Now there are many machines that are the newer machines now that have all the automatic threading, and they are going to basically insist that you thread it a certain way, and they may even raise the foot for you and lower the foot for you at the appropriate times. We need a tighter tension in that bobbin area to pull that needle thread to the back of the design. Most machines accomplish this by having a different bobbin case that's already pre-adjusted to have a tighter tension. And in addition, you may have a little finger, or you may have a little pigtail, or you may have a little finger that you thread that bobbin thread through to give it an additional tightness. If you have an 8 series machine, then you will thread your bobbin area a little bit different for embroidery than you do for sewing. If you have the 7 series machine, there's no changes needed because the machine is going to make that adjustment for you. And always use a good quality thread for proper stitching. Although it may be tempting to use up all those little bits and pieces of threads in your stash, threads especially formulated for embroidery give you much better results. These are created and tested to withstand the heat and the friction that is associated with the high speeds of the embroidery process, and plus it is the right weight, and designs are digitized for this specific weight of thread. You should also use a good quality bobbin thread. Embroidery bobbin thread is typically a smaller weight than the top embroidery thread. This difference in the weight is another thing that aids in pulling that bobbin thread to the back side. Now there is an exception to this rule, as there always are, and that is if you're doing quilting designs, and in that you're going to thread it the same in the needle and the bobbin, and even the same thread. You're going to thread the bobbin for regular sewing, not for embroidery. And you should use an embroidery needle. Needles are very important in sewing and in embroidery. An embroidery needle is specifically designed for embroidery thread. It has a larger eye in the needle, and that's what protects that thread as it's going in and out of the needle at such high speeds. Most commonly you're going to use a size 80-12, But if you're using and embroidering on a lightweight fabric, a smaller needle is needed, and if you're embroidering on a heavyweight fabric, then you're going to use a larger needle. And again, just as in sewing, you're going to use a sharp needle for woven fabrics, and you're going to use a ballpoint needle for knit fabrics. Tension problems. This is what is very hard to diagnose sometimes and what can really be frustrating. But before you even go to the tension dial to try to fix this, be sure you do a few things. That first one is to change the needle. A dull needle can create loops or tight stitches that mimic tension problems. Replacing your needles often will help your embroidery stitches stay neat and even. And then, of course, rethread, both the needle and the bobbin. Often the thread may not be lying in the tension disc quite properly, which can cause the stitching to be too loose, or it may be catching somewhere in its path, which adds tension to the thread. And we've always been taught that cleaning is important for a sewing machine, but it's even more important for an embroidery machine because you're stitching at far greater speeds. There's much more lint and fuzz than you would normally encounter. Lint buildup can cause real problems, so make sure you clean that out, and then check to make sure there's no tiny little bits of thread that could get stuck in that bobbin case area. It's recommended that you clean your machine often. So clean your machine out. I clean mine out after probably couple of sew outs that I do, and then oil your machine as recommended by your dealer. Here is an example of extreme tension problems, and that was where we were threading earlier with the foot down. This is an example of what could happen here. The thread did not get between those two tension dials, so when the machine started stitching, it sent a whole bunch of thread down into that bottom area. Now usually we can hear this sound. It makes a really loud ka-chunking sound, one that even anybody in the room will turn around to look at to see what is going on. So if you hear that ka-chunking, then go ahead and stop the machine, turn it over, and see if this bobbin area has all of these needle threads here. At this point, it's fairly easy to clip this off and then start over again. If you have loose thread tension over the entire front, then where the thread just doesn't look quite snug enough or it looks too loose, then you're going to need to tighten the needle tension. You may have this as a function inside your machine, so raising the tension dial up even a quarter of a point or 0.25 at a time will help. You may have a dial on the top of your machine, but again, turn that dial only a quarter to a half step at a time. Now, if you see the bobbin thread showing on the top, then you're going to do just the opposite. You're going to loosen the needle tension, which means you go to a lower number and do that again, quarter to a half step at a time until you're satisfied with the way the design looks. Here is where I started stitching this design. At the top was at the regular tension, and I just gradually started loosening it as I was sewing out my test sew until I got to the bottom. This may be quite loose. If I remember correctly, it was around a 1 when my tension is usually like a 2.75. So it could be quite a significant difference in order to make it look better. Now all of these things also, you could have used your bobbin and adjusted your bobbin tensions, but that's not always quite as easy. With the 8 series that you see on the left, it's really pretty easy to tighten or loosen that tension. And check your manual to see how easy it is. You just put the little tool here and turn it to the right or the left to loosen or tighten. With the regular bobbin case, it's a little bit more difficult because you have to unscrew, turn it to the right to tighten, to the left to loosen. Many manufacturers and many dealers would prefer that you not loosen that tension on that tension dial because it's set for that particular bobbin and that thread. They've worked hard to get it that way. But if you're having problems, you could take that in and have them work with you with that tension. There are special cases when it's very common that you need to adjust that needle tension, and that is if you're using specialty threads or heavier or lighter threads than what you normally use. If your thread is heavier than the average weight, then you may need to reduce your needle thread tension. If your thread is lighter than the average 40 weight thread, you may need to increase the needle tension. And the other case where it's very, very common is if you are working on very, very small lettering. The tiny satin stitches create a tension that is just too tight. So if you see those little telltale white dots, then you know you're going to need to reduce the tension. Now here's a tip that can save you the headache of having to mess with this tension quite so much, and that is if you use a matching bobbin thread color in your bobbin, the same colors as in your needle. And for this tiny lettering, I would even suggest that you maybe use the same pretty Isacord embroidery thread in the needle and then wind a bobbin also. And then you don't have to worry because the threads, if the needle thread does show or the bobbin thread does show on the top, you won't know the difference. Some other cases is if you're using red work or even outline designs, sometimes triple stitches that go around that design tend to kind of run a little bit tight. So you may need to loosen that needle slightly. But something that sometimes works just as well is if you just slow the machine down. So when you get to those areas around the design, then just slow the speed down on the machine, or if you know you're doing a red work design, slow the machine down all the way through. When the needle thread breaks or frays, the first thing to do is rethread the needle and then rethread the bobbin. And then you need to make sure that that thread is not getting caught anywhere. Make sure that it's not wound around something that you can't see. Replace the needle. Even if you just changed the needle for this particular design and it starts off this way, change the needle again, because sometimes even a brand new needle can have a burr on the end of it. And then if all of these fail, try using another cone of thread and see if it's maybe perhaps something has happened to your thread cone itself, your cone of thread. If your needle should break, first thing you need to do is try to find all those little pieces, because you don't want those getting stuck down there in the bobbin area and getting caught where they shouldn't get caught. And then check the threading paths. This sometimes happens with spools of thread where the thread gets caught between the thread spool and the end cap, or it gets wound around somewhere. So make sure that you are using the proper spindle. So you should use for the stacked threads, you should use a vertical spool pin. And for the cross wound threads, you're going to usually do better with a horizontal spool pin. And then you need to use the proper cap for your machine. Make sure that there are no burrs or on the cap that where the thread could get caught and jerk that needle and make the needle break. Sometimes your needle breaks because it's just too small for your fabric or the combination of fabric you're using. So if that's the case, then change to a larger needle. And then sometimes it breaks if you're stitching a very stitch-intensive design, very, very dense stitching. If that happens, then try changing to a smaller needle. Now this sounds very, very counterintuitive, but the smaller needle can actually slip between the threads easier than a larger needle. And then using a titanium coated needle helps because they're specially formulated so that they don't break as easy. And then the outlines are off. This is very frustrating, but let me tell you before we go further that this is probably the easiest embroidery problem to fix. Just keep a set of fine-tipped markers in as many colors as possible handy, and then just very carefully color in those areas where you have the thread, the fabric showing through, and no one will be the wiser except for you. You always should use proper stabilizer. You should use more than one layer occasionally. If your design is very stitch intensive, it doesn't hurt. If you're using more than one layer, or even if you're using just one layer, you should use temporary spray adhesive. If you've got 2 layers, spray the 2 layers together, then spray the top. If you're using just one layer, spray the top and then adhere it to the back of the fabric before you hoop. What this will do will keep the fabric and the stabilizer together, and it will keep them from shifting, and it will help to prevent those gaps. Choosing the right size hoop will help also. If you choose the hoop size that is closest to the size of the design, that's generally going to give you better results because it's going to secure and hold the fabric better if you choose that size hoop. And then remember, you have those set screws that are supposed to be used for a reason. You need to unscrew the screw before you start to hoop. This prevents your fabric from being stretched as it goes in the hoop, and it also makes it easier to hoop. And then very, very vitally important, if your outlines are off quite a little bit, then check to see how tight you're getting that screw after your fabric has been hooped. The compression between the inner ring and the outer ring has to be very, very tight so that this fabric doesn't slip as the design is stitching. And if the fabric slips or moves in towards the center of the hoop, then the outlines are not going to stitch in the proper registration. Sometimes the whole design element doesn't line up. As you see, the little frog looks like he may have 4 back legs. This was caused actually by an electrical problem here. And to prevent that from happening, you're going to use a surge protector, not a power strip, and with a surge limiting voltage of 330 volts. Those words will be written on the back of your surge protector, and what that will do, it will keep your machine from getting a brownout or a blackout, because when you get a reduction in the amount of electricity that's flowing through your machine, that's where your machine sometimes wants to go sew in another spot, and you have completely off outlines. If you're going to sew that design again, remember, before you go to all of that trouble, go ahead and turn the machine off and back on again before restarting the design, because sometimes the machine will remember that it had made that jump, and it thinks it's trying to be helpful to you, and it will recreate that same jump if you don't turn the machine off and back on. And then it could be caused by a bump to the machine arm. So check the space behind the machine to make sure it's not hitting a wall. Check the space in front of the machine to make sure it's not hitting a chair or even you sitting in front of the chair. If your design has puckers around it, that is usually because the hoop was not tightened enough. When you hoop the fabric and we tightened it back up, the compression wasn't tight enough. So loosen that before you start to stitch. This problem, though, can usually be fixed at least to a fair degree here by pressing. Place the design face down on a fluffy towel and then press. Usually all of those little puckers will go completely away. If your fabric doesn't lie flat around it, this is caused by stretching the fabric as you were hooping the design. Then when you take the design out of the hoop, the fabric goes back and it makes this little pucker all the way around it. So make sure you loosen the set screw before you hoop and don't stretch the fabric. Although you may be doing a great job at keeping the machine clean, follow the machine's manufacturer's suggestion and take the machine in for its routine cleaning. Technicians are trained to clean areas that are not accessible to us as computers, and it's imperative that you take it in for its regular maintenance. A little bit of maintenance can go a long way in preventing a future problem. And technicians are also trained to check for burrs on the stitch plate or the bobbin case. So if your thread continues to break or fray, So that concludes our program for today. We wish you much success with your next embroidery project.